Well, it may sound like a silly question, but why do conservatives and libertarians want tax cuts? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men, I just want to kind of do a little popcorn round of questions here and have you sort of bounce back to me. What are the typical reasons you hear for when you hear a conservative, a Republican, or a libertarian saying we should cut either the individual tax rate or the corporate tax rate? Steve, what do you think is kind of the most common rationale behind that?
I want my money back, you SOBs. Quit wasting it.
Yeah, so, okay.
I mean, look around us. Look at the condition of our streets. Look at what government has done to our cities. Look at all the just basic things government is supposed to do, and how poorly it does all of it. And tell me they need more of my money.
Okay, so I want my money back just for selfish reasons, but I also don't think that the money I'm sending you is really doing what you said it would do. Bill, what other kinds of excuses do we, or I should say, rationale do we hear from either even the White House or Congress or whatever when you hear Republican leaders saying we need to cut the individual or the corporate tax rate?
I never listen to those people. My response would be my motivation is the same motivation as I would have if I crawled out of the Amazon and found myself covered in leeches and decided not to pull them off. Of course I would pull them off. I wouldn't say, well, these leeches have a right to survive too. I mean, they're God's creatures just as well. And who am I to deprive them of their food source? And think of all the things think of all the baby leeches that depend on these mommy and daddy leeches that are out there working so hard to bring home the blood bacon and so on and so on and so on. I completely agree with Steve. There is a tax rate. I don't know what it is, but the market could determine it. When I say the market, I mean the economy. There is a tax rate that is best for the people and best for the government. There's a tax rate and it's way below what we're paying now. You're generating maximum revenues for the government, but that's not the problem.
Well, let me push back against that, because you're the Tea Party guy. You're the taxed enough already guy, okay?
Yes.
And people forgot what the T, acronym stood for. But you're saying we're taxed enough already, and at some point, perhaps in the distant future or distant past, there was the ideal tax rate. I say baloney.
Well, first of all, the ideal tax rate is not something that existed in the past. The ideal tax rate is a mathematical point on a curve. You can look at the Laffer curve. You can look at the fact that you can either have a bigger slice of a small pie or a smaller slice of a big pie, and given two different pies, you'll be able to determine which more apple pie do you get. Do you get a bigger slice of a small pie or a smaller slice of the big pie? Which one gives you more pie? And that's what the Laffer curve says, so it's not my opinion. It's not in the past. There's that. The second thing is, this is not about taxing, it's about spending. When will there ever be enough? And we're not getting, if we had enough aircraft carriers so that we could line them up front to bow to stern, and I could walk over to Cuba on just on the decks of these things, then I might say, well, at least we're getting something for our money. If we had a space program, remember when America had a space program? Remember that? When we could fly men and women into space, remember those days? And NASA spends as much now as they did when they were flying space missions. So it's not a taxing problem, it's a spending problem. And the answer is, the reason I want tax cuts, Scott, is because we have seen throughout all of human history, but especially in the last 20 or 30 years, that $20 trillion in debt, $20,000 billion in debt. It's not what they took from us. That's how much they had to print, is an indication of a system and an individual who is so deep in the grips of addiction and so deep in the denial of the addiction that these people need to be taken away in a rubber room, and they need some treatment and some therapy. Scotty, the whole idea of a tax cut is to detox these politicians, because God knows they can't control their own spending, so we have to control it for them.
Well, let me take that softball and throw it to Stephen Green, because Bill Whittle, quoting the laughable curve, says that essentially that there's a certain break-even point where the government, when they cut the taxes low enough, that the economy will produce more revenue. Steve, isn't it true that both political parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, want more tax revenue revenue. It's just the Democrats think they can get it by sucking harder on your, that superior vena cava, and the Republicans think they can get it somehow by letting you keep more of your own money up front, because ultimately the reduction in the tax rate will increase tax revenues. And your problem, Steve, isn't solved by either one of those.
No, it isn't. We've had two approaches to government, big idea approaches to government in the last 35 years or so. One was Reagan's, which was starve the beast. We're going to cut taxes, and that's going to force Congress to cut spending to eliminate those deficits. And, well, that didn't work. And then we had Obama, whose policy was best described as stuff the beast. We're just going to spend so much on everything that everybody's going to get their comfy little place on the government teat, and that's going to be that. We're going to have permanent increases. And it turned out that worked really well, except for, as Bill said, the $20 trillion in debt. What we have, as Bill said, is a spending problem. Let's go back to Calvin Coolidge, so the last really pre-New Deal conservative we had in the White House. He said, a government which lays taxes on the people not required by urgent public necessity and sound public policy is not a protector of liberty, but an instrument of tyranny. That's the debate we need to have. Not what percentage is the correct amount to tax this or to tax that, but what percentage size is the federal government over what it's supposed to be.
Well, Mr. Coolidge, I think that gets down to what the meaning of sound is and what the meaning of urgent is. Bill, I think...
But that's a real debate. Otherwise, we're just talking about the margins.
Bill, there are a lot of conservatives who will say, if we cut the corporate tax rate, then the companies will have more money to spend, and that money will go back into the economy, and it will produce greater GDP, and essentially the rising tide lifts all boats. But the people on the left would say, hey, wait a minute. When excess profits, as they would call them, came in during the last decade, what did big corporations do with that? Did they increase the pay of the average worker? No, they quadruple, quintupled, and multi-dodecahupled the pay of the average executive. So basically their argument is, you give that money back to corporations, and they're going to just blow it on their top executives. The rich fat cats get richer. You and I wind up with stagflation.
I'm about to cut the Gordian knot on this issue, and I'm going to do it with one question. Who works for who? Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? If the government works for us, and it seems to be the case because we're paying them, if the government works for us, they're our employees, and we can determine whether or not they're worth the salary that we're paying, and if we don't like them, we can get other employees. Does the government exist for the American people? Do they work for us? Do they provide what they need to provide at the smallest cost to us and our money? Or do we work for them? Are we essentially just toiling machines that generates revenue so that a perpetual, eternal class of politicians and bureaucrats can spend and spend and spend, not only on themselves, but on what they need to do in order to buy the votes to stay in office for each other? So who works for who? And once you understand this question, then everything else gets very clear. If it turns out that they work for us, then we should demand that they do the job that we sent them the money to do, and they do it at the smallest possible cost. And they have a salary, and if they don't want to work for that salary, then that's fine. They can get a job in the private sector. But they're treating us like we work for them. They're treating us like a food source. I wasn't kidding about leeches. They look at the American people as a food source, not as a group of citizens, not as people they're indebted to. It's a giant workforce. It's a giant, enormous, big, fat creature that they can go in and keep sucking the blood out of forever and ever and ever. That way they don't have to go hunting and get their own food. I think the government works for us. And that means, to me, they're taking way too much of our money, and they're not doing anything with it, except making themselves rich.
And I'll piggyback on Bill's answer and say, I think the government works for us. And right now, the government is doing all kinds of things for us that I didn't hire them to do. They are bringing in more income. I mean, I think they're legitimately doing all kinds of stuff out there. But my point in conducting this episode the way I just did, with sort of batting about these issues and dealing with these common concerns, is because members would know about this because we clued you into this on our pre-show this week's backstage episode. But my contention is that the whole tax debate is being argued on the left's field, in the left's
Always.
arena. And the question then becomes, well, how much of a tax cut, or should there be a tax cut at all? Well, what happens when the government is deprived of that revenue? Isn't it the poor that suffer the most? Oh, by the way, if you look in the past at tax cuts, well, the economy didn't really always turn around when there was a tax cut. And by the way, we had great boom times in the 1950s when the corporate tax rate was 95% or whatever. And so there are all of these back and forth arguments that can be made having to do with the practicality and the efficiency and the efficaciousness, the effectiveness of tax cuts. What we're not talking about is what is the role of government at the federal, state, and local level. And when you get that focused down to that, when you start a company, you don't go, well, I think I'm going to hire 6 people and pay them $100,000 a year. You first determine what it is that needs to be done in order to accomplish the missions of that company. And then you take it from there. And then you say, well, what's the best price I can get for somebody who's competent to perform this objective? And you don't hire somebody, if you're a company that's making, microprocessors, you don't hire somebody who's in charge of baking cookies. It's just not necessary. It's not part of the job. And so my entire argument is that conservatives, Republicans, and libertarians ought to be basing their discussion, whether they overtly or covertly do this, on what is the role of government. And for me, that would mean, what does the Constitution say? And within the confines of the Constitution, what do we have the expectation to pay for at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level, and what things should be removed from the ineffective, inefficient maw of government altogether, because we have no need of somebody baking cookies in this microprocessor factory. So that, I think, if we could do anything and change the debate from how much, how often, when, and at what does taxed enough already mean, and at what point would you stop saying we're taxed enough, and where can we get to a discussion where we can say, why does the government collect taxes, for what purposes, and what should it perform? Bill, did you want to add something else? It looked like you were starting to...
No, I was just going to say, once you understand that they say that they need the money in order to provide the services, but once you understand that they provide some services in order to get the money, everything becomes clear.
Yes, yes. Well, and I had this crazy notion when I was in county government, and I said to several of my colleagues, and I felt like I was speaking in some, speaking Urdu to a bunch of people who had never even heard of the language. But basically I said, they kept saying, well, more people are moving into the area, therefore we have to increase taxes. And I said, really? I would think more people coming into the area are increasing the tax base. So why do we need to increase taxes if you have more people building houses and moving into the area? So, and I kept having this fantasy that there was a certain share of wallet that county government deserved, that to be able to take care, not deserved is not the right term, but with a certain share of wallet, let's say it's 17%, 7%, I don't know what it is, but there's a certain share of wallet, and then it doesn't matter what happens to the population. If the population goes up, if the population goes down, it makes no difference, because we know what that share of wallet is. Apparently, and that's why I kind of laughed when you said it, Bill, that's like a madman's fantasy. But I do think that we can have a serious discussion in a bipartisan, multi-partisan manner and say, let's forget the tax cut debate right now. Let's talk about, what do you think the federal government should be doing? Why should it be doing that? Can you make the case that no other level of government could do it, or no one else could do it beyond government? And then we get down to, okay, well, what's it going to cost?
Yeah, Scott, you just shouldn't call it cookies, okay? That's too enticing.
Yeah, I know, and I haven't had lunch yet. So for Bill Whittle and Stephen Green and the entire team at BillWhittle.com, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.